This video will cover the causes of the Cold War and the social, political, and economic impacts it had on America. First, we will discuss the causes of the Cold War, which was a tense standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union, and an ideological battle between capitalism and communism. The Yalta Conference, the final conference of the Big Three, led to some of the primary issues of the Cold War. The agreement that Russia must join the war against Japan would backfire for America due to Russia being given control of Manchuria, leading to a communist overthrow in China 4 years later. Russia's entry into the war was proven to be unneeded because of quick Japanese surrender after the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Another agreement of the Yalta Conference was to divide post-war Germany into 4 occupation zones held by America, Britain, France, and Russia. When the Western Allies promoted a reunited Germany, the Soviet Union refused, leading to the creation of East and West Germany. This division led to the Soviets blocking off all rail and highway systems from Berlin to hopefully starve out the Allies within. Hey, that rhymes. This led America to organize the Berlin Airlift, a year-long mission that had American pilots ferrying supplies into Berlin, which saved the grateful Berliners and led to Russia lifting their blockade in May 1949. This next section will focus on the American Cold War policy of containment. The containment doctrine was introduced by Soviet specialist George F. Kennan. The concept held that the expansionary Soviet Union would be halted by a firm and vigilant containment. President Truman embraced the containment doctrine and enacted it through the Truman Doctrine. The doctrine was made to financially support Greece and Turkey from communist pressures. European nations suffering from economic hardships from the past World War were threatened greatly by communism. To further contain communism, Truman enacted the Marshall Plan, which ensured that America would provide financial assistance to Europe to prevent communism from spreading. America broke political tradition by joining a large European pact known as NATO. The members of the pact considered an attack on one of them to be an attack on all, and that they would protect each other with force if necessary. The Soviet Union countered this military alliance with one of its own, known as the Warsaw Pact. The Soviet Union was not the only rising communist threat that America needed to worry about. While Reconstruction in Japan was successful, nationalist China was not. Due to corruption and Soviet influence, nationalist China collapsed and became a new communist China. This was a crushing blow to the capitalists because of nearly 1/4 of the world's population just fell to communism. Additional bad news came to America in 1949 when the Soviets had exploded their own atomic bomb. To outdo the Soviet weaponry, Truman ordered the creation of the hydrogen bomb, which was 1,000 times more powerful than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The new anti-communist witch hunt became very evident within America. The House Un-American Activities Committee was established to investigate possible communist spies within America. Social changes such as civil rights and more sexual freedom were perceived by many to be linked to communist movements. In the era of President Eisenhower, Senator McCarthy was the most ruthless of the communist hunters. His accusations spread from the Democratic Party to the former Army Chief of Staff and the ex-Secretary of State. The atmosphere of fear and suspicion encouraged by McCarthyism led to many actors, writers, and even political figures having their careers ruined due to being labeled as communists. McCarthy's reign of terror was finally ended when McCarthy attacked the U.S. Army, leading the Senate to finally condemn him for his actions. To prevent the spread of communism in other nations, America involved itself in mostly unsuccessful military conflicts. The war in Korea began when the communist North Korean forces attacked South Korea. The United States became involved officially as in a form of police action, but made up the majority of United Nations troops. Once China became involved in the conflict, South Korea lost ground, eventually establishing a border between it and North Korea at the 38th parallel. While the shooting had stopped, tensions were still high, and approximately 54,000 Americans had died. The war in Vietnam was longer and more complex than the conflict in Korea. In an attempt to unify Vietnam under democracy, America sent troops in to support the corrupt government of the South Vietnam against the communist North. The conflict was not holding any success for the United States and was heavily protested by many Americans. The war eventually died down with President Nixon's foreign policy of Vietnamization, and when President Ford failed to bring more weapons to Vietnam, the South Vietnamese government finally fell to the Communist North. Going back to Europe, East and West Germany were further divided by the Berlin Wall. The wall was built in 1961 to prevent Germans from East Germany from fleeing into West Germany. When the wall was torn down in 1989, the Cold War was considered by many to be over. But before the world could reach such a peaceful time, the Cuban Missile Crisis left the world teetering on the edge of nuclear war. After the Cuban leader Fidel Castro established close ties with the Soviet Union quickly took advantage of Cuba's location relative to America by installing nuclear missiles in Cuba. Once American spy planes discovered the missiles, Kennedy ordered a naval quarantine of Cuba and demanded the removal of the missiles. He threatened that an attack on Cuba would be regarded as coming from the Soviet Union and would result in nuclear retaliation against Russia. After a tense week, the Soviet Union gave in, leading to both sides withdrawing their missiles. President Nixon's foreign policy allowed for him to usher in a period of peace with the Soviet Union. This period of peace, known as détente, relaxed tensions between the powers and allowed them to sign the ABM and the SALT treaties, which helped limit the arms race. Although tensions were temporarily renewed during the Iranian hostage crisis when President Carter boycotted the Olympic Games in Moscow, the new president, Ronald Reagan, finally put an end to the Cold War. Reagan implemented his supply-side economics with the hope to have a trickle-down effect on the poor. Instead, he caused the greatest recession since the Great Depression. More rhymes. And he brought the country into extreme debt. He also placed nearly $2 trillion onto the Pentagon in order to defeat the Soviet Union in the arms race. Reagan only believed in negotiating with the Soviets from a position of overwhelming strength. His plan to develop a missile system in space called the Strategic Defense Initiative was designed to force the Soviet Union to come to the negotiation table. The new Soviet leader Gorbachev created new policies that brought free market practices into the Soviet Union. They required the Soviet Union to shrink its military to raise its economy, which required the end of the Cold War. Reagan's extreme economic spending finally paid off when Gorbachev and Reagan met at 4 separate summits in which they negotiated the INF Treaty to ban intermediate-range nukes from Europe. Eventually, Gorbachev's policies led to the collapse of the Soviet Union into separate republics, and the Cold War was over. This concludes my video on the Cold War. I'm sorry y'all had to sit through that, and I'm going to bed. Good night.